Welcome to this Microdose episode of Beyond the Limits. This is an audio episode on VO2 Max. Now, in this Microdose episode, we briefly cover what VO2 Max testing is, why it's so important, if not the most important metric when considering your health and your mortality, and also we briefly touch on how to improve your VO2 Max. Now, to do a full deep dive and get all the gory detail, please go back to our original VO2 Max episode, as we will discuss all of this in detail and also look at some of the gadgets that can be used to help test your VO2 Max. So VO2 Max, there's lots of vague, slightly just off descriptions of what this actually is, but the definition I'm going to give you today is that it's the amount of oxygen that you can consume or that you can utilise when exercising, and it's measured in volume per minute, so it's literally the volume of oxygen that you can consume in an amount of time when exercising. To simplify it, people have described this as the size of your engine, so the bigger the engine, the faster it can go. But I think I'd like to give a slightly different take on this, and bear with me, but I'm thinking of this more of an orchestra. It's an orchestra basically playing the most challenging symphony. If you imagine, to get to your VO2 max, everything has to be working in its peak forms. You've got to get the air into your lungs. The air has got to go from your lungs into the blood. It's got to get to the tissues. It's got to get pumped around the body by its pump, and it's got to be extracted from the blood into the tissues and then utilised. And it's how much oxygen you can use in that time. And to get the maximum response from that, all of the instruments in the orchestra have to be playing on form to achieve that symphony. There's lots of variables that go into the VO2 max. To get a very high number, like I said, all of the parts of the orchestra have to be playing their tune. There are lots of variables that go into that. There's some of which you can't change or you are non-modifiable, such as your age, for example. So I think we're all aware that VO2 max and kind of athletic performance does unfortunately decline. This peaks in your early 20s and it goes down. I mentioned also that genetics, there's also kind of hundreds of genes that have been identified as being linked to this. There's lots of things that we can modify, such as whether or not we smoke, whether or not we're on medications, whether or not we're hydrated, whether or not we're anemic. Lots of these factors play into, like I said, this orchestra. And I think it's a test, essentially, of every single organ in the body firing at its peak rate.
So VO2 max for me had always been something that athletes or people who really good at endurance events, high level, high performance could have a look at, and that could give them an idea about their training load perhaps. But actually, potentially the more interesting side of this is as a predictor of life expectancy and essentially longevity. So I'm going to read, first of all, just a quote from the American Heart Association. So cardiorespiratory fitness, so CRF, is a potentially stronger predictor of mortality than established risk factors. And what is an accurate or an effective way of measuring one's cardiorespiratory fitness? It's by seeing your VO2 max.
I looked at that as well, the one of the 122,000 in the JAMA in 2018. To give our listeners a bit of context, because you said how the American Heart Association has recommended that it's a more important statistic than all other independent risk factors. Just looking at those numbers, so it categorised people from doing their VO2 max test into 5 categories: this very low, average, above average, good, and elite. I may have got the names of those categories wrong, but what it said from those 5 categories, if you went from the lowest to the highest, this is a 5-fold decrease in your mortality over a decade. And if you're going from the lowest to the second lowest, this is a more significant improvement in your 10-year mortality than if you were to have diabetes, or if you were to have coronary artery disease, or end-stage renal failure, or high blood pressure. We're talking about huge, huge improvements in your 10-year mortality, more so important than whether or not you have one of these huge risk factors that we're always being told about.
It's very common for your GP to look at your risk factors, so measure your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your heart rate, your family history, all of these kind of things, and plug it into a calculator and say, you have 8%, you have 12% chance of having a cardiovascular event in the next 10 years. That's the Q risk formula that we would use. My feeling is there could well be a role here for something that's very simple, a device that can just be rested on someone's chest. They don't need to go and strap an oxygen mask or a breathing mask on their mouth. They don't even need to wear a smartwatch and go for a 10-minute run. They can lie in clinic, have it popped on their chest, and yes, we may be 7 to 10% out in terms of accuracy, but it can give us a little bit of an estimate. If nothing else, that could act as a wake-up call to someone to think that their fitness might not be where it could be. Now, as you alluded to right at the start, a lot of this is genetics. Some of this we can't change, but actually some of this we can. And it may be that those modifiable factors can really be looked at.
So yes, how do we improve our VO2 max? With difficulty is the short answer here. There is also this age-related decline that we've outlined already as well. I don't know if our listeners will understand the zones of exercising, but we talk about this zone 2. This is the gentle exercise that you can kind of do continuously. You're not pushing yourself too much. This exercise does not really improve your VO2 max too much, but I think it's fair to say that you need to build the base of a pyramid before you can put in the peak. There is a certain amount of conditioning that is required to get to the next step, and you certainly can't just go out and hit VO2 max session after VO2 max session trying to just improve it by getting to that point. But the crux of how to improve your VO2 max lies within getting as close to it as you can for as long as you can, and that is ultimately the way you're going to improve your VO2 max. It's incredibly hard to reach this optimum peak of your exercise performance, and getting there takes quite a lot of hard work. It has to be a long and gradual warm-up. You have to increase the blood flow to your muscles to allow them to perform. You have to go through the gears to get there. This isn't something that you can quickly jump to. Now, I'm aware that there's lots of different kind of ways in which people will be told online about how to approach doing VO2 max testing or improving. And I think there's lots of different ways. There's these kind of Norwegian 4x4s, there's this fartlek training, all a form of high intensity training. But coming back to it, it is getting close to your VO2 max for as long as you can. That is ultimately what improves your VO2 max test score. Now, whenever you're kind of doing this, I don't know if you'll go out and do your high intensity training, people will often say, oh, I'm limited by my lungs, or I'm limited by my calves or my thighs, or whatever it is that limits them. When you're trying to achieve your VO2 max, it is the thing that limits you. It is most often that which will improve. We're looking at a VO2 max test having such a strong link, or an inverse link, to all-cause mortality. We should probably be paying more attention to this, shouldn't we?
I've mentioned it already. I think my takeaway here is just that driving force of having a number in front of you where you can look at that gives you a really good estimate of your cardiopulmonary health. And I do think there will be more awareness of this potentially as we move on in terms of preventative health, in terms of longevity and maximising your health.